My name is Joan Ellery, and for most of my adult life, I lived alone in my small blue house on Willow Street in the quiet town of Fairmont, Colorado. I used to think that house was the center of my world, the one place where everything inside me finally had space to breathe. I bought it in my late 20s after years of working too many hours and saving every dollar I possibly could. At the time, I felt like buying a home was the boldest thing I had ever done. I didn't have a partner, I didn't have children, and I didn't have anyone cheering me on. It was just me, my stubbornness, and a bank account I was proud of even though it always felt too small. But when I held the keys in my hand for the first time, I knew I had built something meaningful. That house wasn't big or fancy, but it held my sweat, my hope, and every dream I had not yet dared to speak out loud. The house itself was painted a soft shade of blue, the kind that reminded me of the sky just before the sun fully rises. The porch was white, with two wooden chairs I picked up at a flea market in Boulder for only $40 each. They weren't the most comfortable things in the world, but I loved the way the sunlight hit them in the mornings. Inside, the floors were old but warm, made of a honey-colored wood that creaked under my steps. I liked the sound. It reminded me I wasn't invisible. I even planted a small herb garden behind the house, rosemary, mint, thyme, and a few tomatoes I tried to care for but mostly failed at. Still, the garden gave the air a clean smell in the evenings, which made the house feel alive in its own gentle way. For a long time, life moved in a quiet rhythm. I worked at the public library downtown, checked out books for tourists, filed returns, and recommended crime novels to the older man who came in every Tuesday. I took walks after work, made simple dinners, and spent my nights reading by the window. I liked that peace. I liked knowing that every corner of my home belonged to me because I worked for it, not because someone handed it to me. It was the one truly stable thing in my life. Then one Sunday morning, my parents showed up at my door, without warning. My parents, Richard and Marlene Ellery, lived in Denton, Ohio, over 1,000 miles away. They weren't the kind of people who traveled without a reason. When I opened the door and saw them standing on my porch, stiff and serious, I knew something was wrong long before they even stepped inside. I could feel the tension, a cold edge in the air that settled in my stomach. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us in that small space I had always seen as my shield from the world. My mother placed her purse on the floor, folded her hands, and looked at me in a way that made my throat tighten. My father stood behind her with his arms tucked across his chest, the way he always did when he had decided something and believed everyone else should fall in line. After a moment of heavy silence, my mother said, very calmly, "Joan, we need you to sell this house." I remember blinking at her, thinking I must have misheard. Sell my house? This house? The one thing I owned outright? I let out a small laugh, expecting her to smile, say it was a joke, or at least explain herself. But she didn't laugh. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned forward, as if the closeness would help me understand something impossible. When I asked why, my father answered for both of them. He said they wanted me to sell everything I had and give the money, around $310,000 since the house had gone up in value, to my sister Clara. According to them, Clara's 3 children needed to study at a good university in America or maybe Europe, and she didn't have enough savings to make that happen. They said I was single, I didn't have responsibilities, and I should be the one to make sacrifices because I had the easiest life. I felt something inside me freeze. My house, my only safe place, suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls had started closing in around me. I couldn't believe what they were asking. They wanted me to erase years of effort, years of late-night work and lonely mornings, just so Clara, who had never once asked me how I was doing, could have a life that looked smoother from the outside. I looked at them both and said quietly, "No, I won't give up my home." Those were the hardest words I had ever said to them. I felt like I was standing on a cliff with the wind pushing at my back. My father didn't yell. He simply tightened his jaw, shook his head slowly, and looked at me like I had disappointed him in a way he would remember forever. My mother crossed her arms and said I was being selfish, that family should always help family, and that I was choosing a building over the future of my sister's children. I wanted to shout that I had already been helping family, that I had spent years paying for things they didn't even know about. But I said nothing. Something in my throat made it hard to speak. They stood up, without saying goodbye. They walked to the door, their shoes heavy on the wooden floorboards, and right there in my own kitchen, they told me they were cutting all ties with me. My mother didn't look back as she stepped outside. My father held the door for her with a hard expression, as if the house itself offended him. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood in the kitchen, staring at the place where they had sat only moments before. The room felt different, as if their anger had soaked into the walls. I listened to the sound of their car pulling away and let the silence settle around me. And in that silence, I made a choice that would change everything. When my parents walked out of my house on Willow Street that Sunday morning, something in me felt strangely empty, as if someone had reached inside my chest and removed a part of me I didn't realize I had been holding on to for so long. For years, even when our relationship was fragile, I still held hope that one day they would see me as more than the extra daughter, the one who didn't have a family of her own, the one who didn't follow their scripted path. But after they left that day, calling me selfish in the home I had worked so hard to build, the air shifted. I felt the quiet wrap around me, tight and heavy, and in that quiet, a truth rose to the surface. I was tired, deeply tired. My parents never knew what I carried for them. They never knew the weight of the responsibility I had taken on quietly, without fanfare or expectation. For 2 years, I had been sending $1,200 every month to help them with their bills. They thought they were simply managing well in their retirement, but the truth was that they would have drowned financially without that money. Every time I got paid from the library, I opened my laptop, transferred the money, and then carried on with my day as if nothing had happened. I paid their electricity bill, their water bill, some of their medical expenses, and even helped with groceries. I told myself they didn't need to know because I didn't want them to feel ashamed. I also didn't want them to think I expected anything in return. Love, I believed, should not come with a receipt attached. But the moment they chose to cut ties with me, over a house they felt entitled to, something cracked inside me. I saw how little they understood me. They never once asked how I was living. They never asked how I paid for my home, or how I managed on a librarian's salary. They assumed my life was easy because I was single, as if a woman without children has no real responsibilities. They saw only what they wanted to see. So that same afternoon, I logged onto my bank account. I stared at the numbers on the screen for a long time before canceling the automatic payments. It felt like cutting a rope I had been pulling for years, a rope that had scraped my hands raw without me even noticing. When the final confirmation message appeared on the screen, I felt a deep, unfamiliar sensation. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was relief. Pure, quiet relief. And then the next month came. The day their bills were due, my phone stayed silent. For years, it had always buzzed with some reminder, some alert, some part of their lives pulling at me. But that month, nothing happened. No calls. No messages. No questions about why certain payments hadn't gone through. Just silence. A stillness I had not experienced since I first moved into my home. The quiet settled around me like a blanket, unfamiliar but oddly comforting. At first, that quiet scared me. When you spend years reacting, helping, fixing, and apologizing, silence feels like a threat. It felt as though I had stepped into a large empty room and closed the door behind me. My house suddenly felt too big for one person, and I didn't know what to do with all the space in my mind. I kept expecting my phone to ring with another demand, another criticism dressed as parental advice. But it didn't. And slowly, I realized there was nothing chasing me anymore. Without the monthly stress of worrying about their bills, I discovered time I didn't know I had lost. I began painting again, something I hadn't done seriously since my early 20s. I set up a small canvas stand in the corner of the living room, near the big window that faced the street. Every evening after work, I sat there with my cheap brushes and jars of paint. My hands were stiff at first, shaky even, but the more I painted, the more I felt parts of myself returning, parts one thought were gone forever. I painted little things at first, A bowl of lemons, my garden herbs, the shadow of a chair against the wall. Nothing impressive, but it was mine. I also started taking long walks again. There was a trail by the river only 10 minutes from my house. I used to walk there often when I first moved to Fairmont, but life, bills, and family always seemed to find ways to pull me away from peace. Now, with silence as my companion, I went there almost every afternoon. The river flowed gently, carrying fallen leaves and little twigs along with it, and walking beside it made me feel grounded. I listened to the sound of water hitting rocks, the wind moving through the trees, and the quiet hum of distant cars. It was the first time in years I could hear my own thoughts clearly. My mornings changed too. Instead of rushing to work, I drank coffee slowly, taking my time to savor it. I started buying better coffee beans, $12 a bag instead of the $5 brand I used to settle for. I sat on my small porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching people walk their dogs or head to work. I remembered that simple joys are still joys. My friends noticed the change in me before I did. Emily, who lived in Portland, Maine, called me one evening and said I sounded lighter, as if I had finally put down a heavy suitcase I didn't need to carry anymore. Laura, who lived in Bristol, England, told me I had been too hard on myself for too long, and that choosing peace was not cruelty, it was survival. They reminded me that families are supposed to lift you, not drain you. For the first time in many years, I believed them. The more distance I created, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by obligation. I was always the problem solver, the quiet one, the steady one, the daughter who lived simply and therefore, according to my parents, owed more. But in the quiet, I began to see a different truth. I was allowed to protect my own life too. And that truth changed me. Little did I know that the quiet would not last forever. The next month was coming, and with it, a storm of unanswered calls that would test everything I had learned. But for now, for that one precious month, I lived in peace. The quiet was the first gift I ever gave myself. The first Monday of the next month began like any other. I woke up before sunrise, made my coffee, and stepped onto my porch to watch the street slowly come alive. My neighborhood on Willow Street was usually quiet in the mornings. People walked their dogs, joggers passed by with headphones on, and the mail truck rumbled through at almost the same time every day. I tried to enjoy the cool air and the soft light, telling myself it would be another peaceful day. I believed that, or at least I wanted to. But peace has a way of slipping when the past tries to pull you back. Around 9 o'clock, just as I finished watering the rosemary in my small garden, my phone started ringing inside the house. At first, I didn't rush toward it. I assumed it was a reminder from the library or maybe a message from Emily or Laura. But when I stepped inside and looked at the screen, my heart tightened. The word Dad glowed on the caller ID, bright and sharp, like a warning. I froze. I knew exactly why he was calling. The bills were due. The support they had taken for granted, the support they never even knew came from me, had vanished. The silence they had pushed me into now circled back to them. I stood in the middle of my living room, phone buzzing on the table, and I could feel every beat of my heart thudding in my chest. The ring felt louder than it should have been, like it filled the whole house and left no room for anything else. I didn't answer. I watched the phone vibrate until it stopped. I took a slow breath, knowing what would come next even before it happened. A minute later, it rang again. And again. On the fourth call, something in me shifted. I walked to the table, picked up the phone, and stared at the screen for a long moment. My thumb hovered over the green button, the one that would connect us again. But instead of pressing it, I slid my finger across the screen and hit end. The call stopped instantly, and the house fell into a deep, tense quiet. It didn't take long for the voicemails to start coming through. I could almost hear the anger in their voices before I even listened. The first message was sharp, accusing, full of disappointment. My father's tone was cold, the kind of cold that had followed me throughout my childhood whenever I didn't meet his expectations. "How could you do this?" he said. "You're tearing the family apart." Those words settled heavily in my chest, but they didn't break me like they once would have. The next message was from my mother. Her voice was thinner, more unstable, as if she was trying to hide her fear behind anger. She repeated the same line twice. "We need to talk. Call us back." But her voice shook near the end, betraying the truth beneath her frustration. They weren't calling because they missed me. They weren't calling because they realized they had hurt me. They were calling because they needed something from me once again. As the day went on, the messages changed. The anger softened into confusion, then into panic, then into something desperate. "Please call us. We don't know how to pay the bills. We thought everything was covered. We need your help." Every message cut deeper than the one before, not because I felt guilty, but because it showed how little they had understood all these years. They never once wondered how things were being paid before. They never thought about who had been keeping them afloat. They assumed the world owed them comfort, and they assumed I would always be there to catch their fall. I sat on the couch, listening to each message once, then deleting it. I didn't cry. I expected I might, but the tears didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange calm settling over me, the same calm that had been building since they walked out of my house. It was the calm that comes after you finally understand the truth you've been avoiding, that loyalty without respect is not love, and sacrifice without appreciation becomes a prison. I had spent years being the silent helper, the daughter who gave without asking for anything in return. I paid their bills quietly, covered their emergencies, and made sure their lives ran smoothly. But they had never seen me, not really. I was a tool to them, a resource, a steady back they expected to lean on without question. In their eyes, I didn't have a life of my own. I was simply the one who was fine. The one who could afford to give more, do more, sacrifice more, because I didn't have a family of my own to take care of. That day, as I sat alone in my living room with the warm sunlight crawling across the floor, I realized something important. I didn't owe anyone my life. I didn't owe anyone my home. And I didn't owe anyone the money I worked for simply because I was single. I owed myself peace. And I had chosen that peace when I stopped those payments. Their voices echoed in my mind again and again as the day stretched on. But the more they called, the more something inside me strengthened. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't heartless. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply letting the natural consequences of their choices reach them. They had cut ties with me. They had chosen that separation. I had only honored their decision. By evening, the calls slowed. The house grew quiet again, but this time the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, electric with the weight of all the words left unsaid. I made myself a simple dinner, pasta with tomato sauce, and ate it by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. The phone sat on the table, black and still. I didn't turn it off. I didn't hide it. I simply let it exist without giving it power over me. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle in my chest. I was free. Truly free. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for holding anyone else together. Their panic was no longer my burden. Their voices no longer dictated my choices. I had not answered their calls. I had not looked back. And I had not sent them another dollar. That was the moment I understood something simple, but life-changing. Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is choose yourself and refuse to feel guilty for it. The months that followed the unanswered calls arrived like slow, steady waves, each one softening the old wounds that had once felt so deep. In the beginning, the silence felt sharp, like winter air against bare skin. There were mornings when I woke up expecting to see a long list of missed calls, and nights when I braced myself for another angry voicemail. But as time passed, the noise faded. My parents still tried to reach me, but the attempts became less frequent, scattered like fading echoes of a life I had finally stepped away from. It wasn't that I hated them. I don't think I ever could. It was simply that, for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself, and I didn't want to go back to who I used to be. With the money I once sent them every month, a strange feeling of space began to open in my life. I had spent so long giving everything I had, down to my last breath, that I didn't know what it felt like to do something purely for myself. One afternoon, I stood on my porch and looked at the peeling paint on the railings, something I had ignored for years. Before, I would have told myself that the money was needed elsewhere, that every dollar had a job more important than making my home look nice. But that day, I drove to the hardware store in Fairmont and picked out a warm, honey-white paint for the wood. The can cost $29, and I bought it without guilt. Painting that porch took me 3 days. Long, quiet hours where I listened to the soft scrape of the brush against wood. There was something healing about watching the old, chipped paint disappear under the smooth new color. It felt like giving my home a fresh start, and in a way, giving myself one too. When I finished, the porch seemed brighter, almost proud. I stood there with paint on my hands, breathing in the warm scent of wood and fresh color, and felt a little stronger than before. After I finished the porch, I moved inside. The walls in my living room had faded from years of sunlight. I bought new paint there too, choosing a soft cream that made the whole room feel warmer. It was the first time I had used money on my house simply because I wanted to, not because something was broken or necessary. Every brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had ignored for too long. For the first time in my adult life, I also thought about taking a small trip. Nothing fancy or dramatic, just a quiet place where I could breathe without thinking about responsibility. I chose Harborview, Rhode Island, simply because I had once seen a picture of its shoreline in a book at the library. The trip wasn't expensive. A few $100s for a small rental cottage and gas. Before, I would have felt guilty spending that amount on myself. But when I arrived, the guilt vanished. Harborview is calm, with narrow streets and white houses that looked like they had weathered years of storms, but still stood proud. I spent my mornings walking by the docks, watching boats drift in and out of the harbor. Sea air has a strange way of clearing the mind. I would sit on a wooden bench facing the water and let the sight of the waves settle the thoughts inside me. I realized then how much space sadness had taken in my heart, and how freeing it felt to finally let that space fill with something else, something slow and peaceful. One morning, I bought a small cup of coffee from a bakery called Harbor Moon Cafe, run by an older woman named Margaret. She had worn silver hair braided over one shoulder and asked me if I wanted my coffee strong enough to wake the Atlantic. I laughed in a way I hadn't laughed in months. It felt good, light, and unforced. She didn't know my story, and I didn't share it. She simply gave me a warm cup of coffee for $4, added a small smile for free, and sent me on my way. Sometimes the kindness of strangers feels like a bridge back to yourself. When the trip ended and I returned to my home in Colorado, everything looked a little different. The mountains seemed taller. The sky somehow wider. My home, with its fresh paint and soft cream walls, welcomed me back like an old friend. One evening, as the sun fell behind the peaks, I stood on my newly painted porch and felt a quiet strength rise in me. I whispered into the fading light, "I am allowed to matter too." The words left my lips like a confession and a promise at the same time.
I still thought about my family.
I wondered how different things might have been if they had seen me as more than a backup plan or a reliable wallet. I wondered if they ever sat together at night, thinking about the choices they made. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. Life rarely gives us tidy answers. What I did know, however, was that I couldn't go back, not to the silence of giving everything without being seen, not to the pain of feeling like I had to earn love by sacrificing myself. Life is not made of what-ifs. It is shaped by choices, hard ones, quiet ones, ones that break us and build us at the same time. And I had made mine. I chose the life that let me breathe. I chose the life that respected my own needs. I chose to step out of a pattern that had taken too much from me for too long. Sometimes at night, when the world feels still, I sit by my window with a cup of tea and think about the journey that brought me here. It wasn't easy. It wasn't pretty. No one clapped when I finally stood up for myself. No one called me brave or thanked me for the years I cared for others. But bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to stop letting yourself be used. Sometimes it is the moment you close a door and trust yourself enough not to open it again. My name is Joan, and this is the story of the day I finally stood on my own side, even when no one understood, even when it hurt, even when the world expected the opposite. It was the hardest thing I ever did. And, without question, the most important.